Do you like complex RPGs with meaningful progression systems, deep dungeon crawls, or engaging stories? Or how about reading through tons and tons of dialogue in ye olde English?
I don't know you, and I don't care to know you.
But you'll power through it so you can save the world for your people, who will abandon you faster than a chocobo on steroids when they see some of your fashion choices. It's okay though, you'll meet many other interesting characters with rich backstories and go on adventures around the world with them, until they get ruthlessly killed off one by one. If that's too much to handle, you can retire from being a hero and just waste away your life playing poker at the Gold Saucer. There have been worse things to get addicted to.
FBI, open up!
Or maybe you'd like to focus on your grind to become the best tank you can be, until your healer lets you die because they were too busy googling fan art of their favorite bunny girl waifu. Okay, how about just a fantasy theme park game that you can visit and find fun activities at any time? Well then check this one out. Final Fantasy XIV is a subscription-based tab-targeting MMORPG with steep vertical progression and multiple expansions worth of content, including tons of story, hardcore raid encounters, mounts to collect, and distinct classes to learn. The first time I tried to play this game, I quit because the leveling process was extremely slow, my class was defined by 1 or 2 buttons for many levels, and the quests were just running simulators. But after giving it another try, I truly realized the meaning of it gets good after 100 hours. While I think that any game should absolutely not take that long to start being fun, MMORPGs often don't launch with all the features, content, and quality of life that the players really want or need. They often reach that point after a few years of development. For Final Fantasy XIV, they reached this point later than most. The first patch of the game had a few too many minor mistakes, and they ended up nuking the entire thing and remaking it, then using that as the backstory for their new version of the game, A Realm Reborn. This didn't really hit the mark either, with a lack of voice acting and an extremely linear leveling process. It may take you anywhere from 50 to 100 hours to get to the first expansion content, Heavensward. This is where the game really starts to get good, and the improvements don't end there either. But the question is it worth it to wait that long? The best aspect of Final Fantasy XIV is absolutely the story. It can be slow and drawn out, but the time spent developing characters and building the world translates into meaningful payoffs later on in the story. Like any Final Fantasy before it, except maybe 13, because I try to forget about that one as much as possible. The story is a mix of serious conflicts and playful jokes that results in a buildup of tension, and then it lets it all out with a punchline. One moment you could be stopping an ancient war between humans and dragons, and the next you see a frog holding a wand. And there's plenty of references to previous games in the Final Fantasy series that fans will appreciate. And believe me, that isn't the only type of fan service they'll provide. It's very hard to get into the specifics of why the story is so good because spoilers are a touchy subject in the community, but one of the reasons why the story hits so hard is because of the music. There are so many different songs that contribute to the unique tone of a scene, but because there are so many unique songs, it's more meaningful when there's a reused motif or repeated song because it reminds you of another character or situation that that song is usually tied to, and adds another layer of story that is implied to help you feel what's going on in the scene rather than just telling you outright. And while Final Fantasy is known for having some of the most insane boss battle songs, even the boss music that gets repeated over and over still gets you fired up to smash your buttons and do as much damage as possible and to survive the mechanics, even if you have no idea what you're doing. The story is also well designed because of how it weaves in the dungeons and raids into the main story quest, so you need to learn how the group finder works and how to perform your role in the tank, healer, DPS role system before you reach the end game, thus preparing you throughout the journey while also creating more intense story points around these dungeons and raids. And these dungeons stay relevant and have people running them at all times because of the duty roulette system and the leveling system. You can learn all roles and all classes on one character just by swapping the weapon you have. So if you want to play a Dragoon, you equip a Lance, and now you're a DPS. And if you want to play a Paladin, you equip a Sword and Shield, and now you're a tank. But you need to level up that class independently, which means you need to run older content to level them up, And there are specific roulettes, which are essentially randomized group finders, which will pair you up with players completing their story instances. This is sufficiently rewarding to motivate players to essentially help others. This allows Square Enix to place the story parts of the gameplay at the beginning or ending of these dungeons or raids so that the gameplay keeps its pace and the story is optional for those just helping out. However, there are a few not so minor issues with the progression systems of the game. Because the story and dungeons are balanced to a specific level, to participate in lower level dungeons or story missions that you have leveled beyond, you need to be downscaled to that level of content. This doesn't just reduce your stats, it also devolves your class to a more simplistic state because you'll lose access to some of your skills. So even though you just set up a new keybind for that awesome new skill you learned, you can't actually use it in a dungeon because you haven't reached the appropriate level of story or dungeon yet. Also, you might be an extremely skillful max level black mage, but because you're downscaled, you have to relearn your rotation because half your keybinds will work differently or just not be enabled, and that isn't so bad if you're just doing normal dungeon roulettes where optimization isn't necessary. But for some classes, you just won't have fun during the leveling process because it doesn't become a fully fleshed out class until you reach later game content. At first, this helps you learn your new skills as you level up one by one, but later on it just becomes a mess as different classes mechanics weave in and out of your playstyle. This issue is compounded by the fact that almost nothing you do matters until you have done the main story quest, which is a linear quest line that can take hundreds of hours until you reach the end game. There are multiple ways to level different classes on your character, such as doing the story, hunting monsters, queuing for roulettes, or doing fates, which are open world events. But if you're leveling your first class on this character, there's no reason to do any of that besides the story. This is because you unlock new zones and new dungeons and raids by doing the story. You can't decide that you want to level up to 60 and then do the level 60 raids and dungeons. You need to do all the story up until that point, then do the quest to unlock access in the group finder. It results in an overwhelming feeling that nothing you do is worthwhile outside of the main story quest. But also remember that you need to pay attention and read tons of dialogue because not everything is voice acted, especially in the first 100 hours of the game. And this, I believe, is the main hurdle that players must get over before they can start enjoying the game. It's highly suggested that you speed read or multitask while doing the story because there's only so many times you can hear the character say, "Pray, return to the waking sands mayhaps," before you start to zone out. Now, if you take your time and don't worry about progressing the story too fast, you can avoid burning out. But imagine a scenario where a friend who plays the game tells you how cool the endgame raids are and asks you to come raid with them in Final Fantasy XIV. With how many expansions and patches worth of main story quests that exist out there, you could maybe start playing the game with your friend in a year. Many people will say that this is because it's a Final Fantasy game before it's an MMO, but that isn't a good thing in my opinion. An MMO should be an MMO first, promoting player interaction and choice before long linear quest lines. If you want a single player game, then why are you playing an MMO? The reality is that people prefer to interact with other players only when they want to, but always want the option to stick to themselves to be available. So even though MMOs are more social, Square Enix wants to appeal to those introverted players who got invested in some of the more stoic or thoughtful characters of the previous Final Fantasy games. Now, the level gating issue can be solved by purchasing a level boost, which also skips your character up to the current expansion's main story content. It's a solution, but one that solves a problem that is created by the developers as a means to make money, which while I don't blame Square Enix for doing it, I also can say that it makes the game worse because while you should experience the story in a linear manner, why not give players who aren't interested in the story the option to skip it if they can level up without it? Or if you, heavens forbid, wish to play another character to experience a different race, then you would need to unlock all of the dungeons and raids again through the main story quest. The extra fee would be okay, but the game already requires you to purchase the expansions and pay a monthly sub fee, which you can only pay for with real money, which some would argue is a good thing to prevent the game from being pay to win, but it does mean the game becomes quite high investment in time and money. Despite all the systems that help newer players get into endgame content and all the support for roleplay, Final Fantasy XIV is not a casual MMO because you pay with your money or your time. And unless you're well off, you'll want to play the game a lot to get your money's worth out of it. And this perceived need to play the game in conjunction with the fanatical fan base of the Final Fantasy franchise is why I believe that the community of Final Fantasy XIV can become so tribalistic, even more so than the average invested MMO player. But don't get me wrong, Final Fantasy XIV gives you your money's worth. There's a free trial that allows you to play up to the first few expansions before you ever make a single payment to the game. So the first 300 hours could be free. And when you do reach the end of the free trial, you only need to buy the latest expansion, and it includes every previous expansion. And there's plenty of content and game modes to get lost in. You can visit the Gold Saucer to play minigames and participate in events to earn prizes, and build up your triple triad card deck to duel other NPCs and players around the world. There's also plenty of roleplay opportunities, which is missing from many RPGs today that are more focused on providing a quality game experience. While Final Fantasy XIV has the gameplay quality, it also has more meaning to why you are playing that content because of how much your character's progression ties into the story, and there are class quests adjacent to the main story that provide extra identity for the choices you made. There are also roguelike dungeon crawlers inspired by the classic Final Fantasy games, where you progress an independent leveling system while trying to survive traps and somewhat random encounters, and every 10 levels is a big boss that allows you to save your progress. I always enjoy more hardcore content that you can do as a solo player, because waiting in DPS queues during off hours can take quite a while. But without a doubt, the most developed content is the raid encounters, which have varying difficulty levels so you can play them your first time for the story. If you want to go even further into punishing mechanics and role-based group progression, then you can take on the Savage or Extreme level raids, which are without a doubt some of the most complex and challenging content in any MMO. One issue I have with the raids is that the tab targeting combat is a bit disconnected, where animations and mechanics occur at different times than they appear to be happening. You can see the large indicators for where you need to avoid the mechanics, but the actual attack effect occurs after the indicator disappears, meaning it's harder to understand what's going on in a fight by just looking at what's going on. You need to learn through trial and error the timings of the mechanics, or look at an enemy cast bar, which isn't ideal. If you're progressing through challenging content, then clarity of mechanics is important. But to be fair, they somewhat alleviate this later on by showing mechanics preemptively through visible animations. Then the indicator appears briefly to show the range, but still hit around the same time that the indicator appears. But the combat still has a slow and disconnected feeling due to the tab targeting system with long global cooldowns. But once you accept how things work, utilize the vast customizability of the UI, and play around the skills that are off the global cooldown to maximize how much damage you can do within your burst combos, the diverse class systems are still fun to learn and manage. Although there have been improvements to the PvP modes over time, they're not amazing. The classes are simplified with different skills that are similar to your normal PvE skills, which I honestly would prefer the entire game to be designed like. All the different buffs you need to press in combat could be tied to certain skills, like they are in PvP, to simplify and reduce the amount of keybinds you need. But because PvP is such a small portion of the game that is a nice casual fun, but isn't too popular, it's taxing to try to develop muscle memory for your playstyle when it changes so drastically. And that gets further compounded if you want to learn multiple classes in both PvE and PvP. So while the PvP is nice to do daily for some extra experience and leveling your characters, it isn't something that you can get too invested in. If you aren't into story or long-term RPG progression systems, then Final Fantasy XIV might not be the game for you. But even if they are for you, it can still be a struggle to get to the good parts. However, it's easy to forget the issues with the game when you get immersed in the music, the characters, and the full features of the game that make it feel complete. Square Enix has been improving the game for many years now, and the little details they add here and there, along with the constant additions and improvements in the game based on what the community asks for, creates an image of what is truly the ultimate Final Fantasy game. Despite Final Fantasy XIV being an MMO that I have so many issues with, from the moment-to-moment gameplay and the leveling process, it's still one of the best games I have played, and I'm still only scratching the surface when it comes to the amount of content left for me to experience. And due to the growing player base and many different features from the franchise that they could add as fan service, like Blitzball or Fort Condor, there's still a long ways to go before this game becomes final. But if you like this video, please be sure to subscribe for more content like this, and help me out by giving the video a thumbs up, and I will see you all next time.